Welcome back, AP US History, to our second screencast on Reconstruction. So today we're going to be focusing on the time period that's known as presidential Reconstruction. But really what we're going to be doing is just trying to lay out the different arguments and the different viewpoints about Reconstruction, both in the North and a little bit about some of the viewpoints in the South as well. So the two big questions of Reconstruction is number one, how many rights will the new freedmen, the newly freed slaves receive? And then to what degree is the federal government going to go to protect these rights? So to what lengths are they going to go to protect these rights of the newly freed men? And the second big question of Reconstruction is going to be, how will former Confederate states be readmitted to the Union? So is it going to be simple and easy process? Is it going to be difficult? Are they going to be labeled as traitors? And the people within the states, and then how will the states themselves be readmitted into the Union? So these are the two big questions of Reconstruction. Now, there's going to be a lot of struggles during Reconstruction. So more than you might think. The first big struggle is the one that's the obvious struggle, again between the North and the South. And as we saw today with that song, the good old rebel, the South is not going to be easily reconstructed. It is going to be a difficult task because largely they don't want to be reconstructed. And so this is going to be a very difficult task for the North to kind of tackle reconstructing the South. Now, it's not just a North-South struggle, though, during Reconstruction. It's very much a struggle within the government to see whose plan is the nation going to follow to reconstruct the South. So it's a battle between the president and Congress to kind of see who's going to take the lead in Reconstruction. So that's really what's going on here in the beginning part, from 1865 to 1867. So I don't really personally love the title Presidential Reconstruction, because really between 1865 and 1867, the president begins to take the lead, but it's much more of a struggle, a battle between Congress and the president to kind of see who is going to ultimately run Reconstruction. And a lot of elements in Congress and the president have very different viewpoints about how to proceed with Reconstruction and what to do. What's the proper process for it? So I just want to kind of jump to the different viewpoints of these different factions within the government. So the first is going to be President Andrew Johnson's viewpoint. So number one, let's kind of get some background about Andrew Johnson. He is, first off, a Southerner. So he was born in the South, about 100 miles actually from Abraham Lincoln, and he ends up being a senator from Tennessee. Now, Tennessee secedes from the Union, but what makes Andrew Johnson different is that he actually is the only senator to stay in the Union from the South, and he decides to leave and stay with the Union instead of leaving with his state. And so he's a Democrat at the time also, and he's going to actually flip parties, and he's going to be a Republican. And that's what's going to get him on the ticket, on the Republican ticket with Abraham Lincoln. Now, another thing to know about Andrew Johnson is that he grows up a poor white in the South. So he's very resentful of the rich white people in the South, who he feels kind of have a disproportionate control over Southern society and especially influence in the government. Now, he believes overwhelmingly that the president should dictate Reconstruction. And that's partially because of his personality. He does have a controlling personality. But he just there's no constitutional background or constitutional precedent as to who should control Reconstruction. And so he believes it's the president's job to control something like this, to control Reconstruction, as commander-in-chief of the army. He's opposed to black rights, so what you're going to see here is that Andrew Johnson does have a very typical Southerner's viewpoint as far as white supremacy and the inferiority of black people in the South. And so he's going to be against suffrage, and he's also going to be against the federal government going down and protecting the civil rights of African Americans. So to Johnson, the 13th Amendment is enough. Giving them their freedom is enough. You don't have to, the federal government doesn't have to extend and protect their rights and give them voting rights as well, and force the South to give them voting rights. And he's definitely for lenient readmittance into the Union. So he's not for kind of a very strict policy and punishing them and treating them as traitors. He's very much in line with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln kind of throws out a plan, a very tentative plan, before he gets assassinated, and Abraham Lincoln was saying something along the lines of 10%. If 10% of the Confederates in a certain state pledge their loyalty to the United States, and they should be readmitted. And Johnson very much follows along the lines of Lincoln's plans for readmittance into the Union. Okay, so on the complete flip side, you have the radical Republicans, and this is a growing part of the Republican Party, who are pretty extreme for their time period in their views. We might not really see them as extreme today, but at that time period, they did have extreme views as far as racial views and as far as definitely how to reconstruct the South. So what these people want in Congress, these guys believe that Congress should dictate Reconstruction completely. They feel like this is a legislative body's job, not the president's job, to dictate Reconstruction. They favor broad rights for black people in the South. So definitely suffrage, definitely protection of their civil rights, and it has to be the federal government that ensures their protection of their civil rights. The next thing that's pretty radical at the time, and we might still consider this to be radical, is they believe in land redistribution in the South. So these slaves have been working on the plantations for generations and generations. And so what they believe in is breaking up the big plantations and actually giving plots of land to the former slaves who used to work these plantations. And the last thing that they believe in is they're not in the same line as President Johnson as far as leniency towards the Confederates. They want harsh treatment of the Confederates. And sometimes their rhetoric goes much more beyond what they actually want instituted, but they do view them as traitors. And they do believe that people should be punished for this. Somebody needs to be punished for what the South did and what the South dragged the North through in the Civil War. So what this kind of leads to is President Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. So they both kind of have different ideologies here. And President Johnson is going to take the lead in Reconstruction. And the reason that he's able to take the lead is that when the Civil War ends, Congress is not in session. And they are not going to come back into session until December. So he has a good 4 months or so to kind of enact his plan for Reconstruction because the other branch of the government is not really there. And so Johnson kind of takes the lead. And so what he does, the first thing that he says as part of his Reconstruction plan is to grant pardons to anybody, not anybody, but to people who are taking a loyalty oath to the Union in the South. So a number of you guys said this today when I said, well, come up with your own Reconstruction plan. And so he says, well, a loyalty oath, this would be a big part of getting back into the Union. So he's going to grant them pardons for that. The second thing that he says is not everybody is going to be exempt and get pardons for just taking a loyalty oath. And the people where he kind of draws the line is going to be the high Confederate officials, meaning generals in the Confederate Army and members of the Confederate government, so like Jefferson Davis, his cabinet members, politicians. They are not going to just get pardons for them pledging their loyalty to the United States. And he specifically targets out wealthy individuals because Andrew Johnson sees wealthy Southerners as the reason for the Civil War, that they were kind of promoting their own self-interest, and that's why the North had to fight the South in the Civil War. So he blames them, and so to a large extent, and so he's not going to grant them pardons automatically for loyalty. They have to petition Andrew Johnson specifically to get kind of readmitted as far as citizens into the Union. The next thing that he's going to say is that every state needs to abolish slavery. And what that means really is to ratify the 13th Amendment that was passed by Congress in 1865. So after the Emancipation Proclamation is passed in 1863, several northern states, border states, are going to abolish slavery on their own. And so the entire North in 1865 is going to pass the 13th Amendment. But what they want from the South is that they have to acknowledge this. The 13th Amendment officially abolishes slavery in the United States. What they want from the South is to admit to this and to ratify the 13th Amendment before they come back into the Union. And if they're not willing to do it, they cannot be readmitted. The last part of Johnson's plan is that they also have to repeal their secession ordinance. So they basically have to take back secession and say that what they did as far as seceding from the Union was wrong. Now, you and me, we might look at this and say this is a very lenient plan, what Johnson wants to enact. But to some Southerners, this is not lenient enough. And so he's going to meet resistance, believe it or not, in the South. And several states are not going to be willing to kind of either repeal their secession ordinance, ratify the 13th Amendment, or take loyalty pledges. And so this is going to kind of not be the easiest plan to enact. And so this is kind of where it kind of leaves an opening for the radical Republicans to come in with even more extreme ideas and say, look, hey, look at the South. Look, they're not even willing to accept this lenient plan. We can't treat them as friends because they're not friends yet. They're still foes. They still kind of have the mentality of enemies. And so what ends up happening here is you have another viewpoint, a moderate Republican viewpoint, in between the radicals and President Johnson. And so they're another group within Congress that are trying to kind of mediate between the radicals and Johnson. And really, so what you really should see here is that you have divergent ideas about how Reconstruction should proceed, and it becomes politics as much as it becomes trying to fix the South. And so politics does kind of get in the way of a lot of the progress that they're trying to make in the South here, kind of the battle between the radicals and President Johnson. So what is the resolution? Well, the resolution is going to be that in the beginning, President Johnson is going to kind of get his way and his plan is going to be enacted, but slowly the radicals are going to kind of chip away at Johnson's power over Reconstruction until they ultimately, by 1867, take over the policies of Reconstruction completely. And so we're really going to dive into the particulars of how they kind of go back and forth tomorrow in class, and then how ultimately congressional Reconstruction begins and the radicals kind of take over and take control over Reconstruction. All right, so I'll see you guys tomorrow in class. Have a good night.